What's up, Pixie?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Oh, it is time. All right, listen up. Pixie and Mindwaves are going to be having a conversation. I am going to be moderating the two of you, okay? Um,
hmm
I will only step in if I feel like you guys are talking past each other or misrepresenting each other's points, but otherwise, you two are just fucking ready to fucking go ham, okay? Good luck.
All right,
Okay.
Pixie.
Um,
Where do rights come
let's
from?
let's start with our original claim, right?
All right.
Um, so let me. That's why I've been like trying to pull up for the 10 minutes, but my computer is being a little bitch. But the claim is basically rights are non-existent if a state is not there, like to protect it. Let me find it. I'm not sure if that was the exact statement.
Okay. Yeah. So we could pull up the exact tweet if you want, or I can try to like reiterate what I actually meant in that tweet if you want. It's up to you.
Maybe we end up just like agreeing with each other if we agree with the first premise. So it's human rights don't exist without a state to enforce them. Don't at me. So what do you mean by that exactly? Or what do you mean? Because like I responded with like rights can basically exist with or without a state. The state has historically violated rights. And then you responded with rights are what was your exact response again? Like let's find it. If you
So,
acknowledge that there's a
mhm.
state, then you acknowledge that like it must be there. Something I forgot what exactly you said.
No, so what I said in reply to that is I quote tweeted you saying, if we agree rights are socially constructed, then we must agree that a state is necessary to protect them, unless you make some nonsense claim that human rights are God-given or found naturally in the universe. Which if I was going to be more precise in my language, I would have said that it's not necessarily the state, but more so governance, right? And I don't think that there is a form of governance that is adequate to protect states or protect rights other than a state. I don't agree with this idea of like anarchist communal policing or governance as being adequate enough to like protect somebody's rights. It's just a fantasy, right?
Okay, I don't even think there's a debate here because what my argument was that like yeah, rights are social constructs, but they will exist without a state. But then you can make the argument that oh, the state is the best way to protect them or not. But that's a separate argument. I don't even think I disagree with you on. So I don't think
So
there's a
what
debate.
what what useful or like what utility does the statement like my right exist if you can't enforce it or enact them?
Well, because then it comes to the whole idea that even if okay, I'm trying to think about how I can properly explain it. If you make the statement that rights only exist because of a state or that their existence comes back to like the state existing, then I can see like an argument in favor of making the claim like, oh, there's no need to challenge like let's say China for violating human rights or that human rights technically can't be violated if the state doesn't acknowledge them to begin with,
Well,
which is
yeah, you
something
can't
I don't think.
violate you can't violate a human's rights if they had no rights in the first place, right?
Well, that's the idea. Human rights, right? The whole idea is that we believe people should be entitled to this or that they're entitled to that, um, should be independent of whether the state mandates it or not. So let's take civil rights, for example. We can argue that all people are entitled to vote, it's their right to vote. Just because the state didn't allow Black people to vote doesn't mean that those people should not have those rights or that those rights are or should be non-existent to those people. They are
Well,
because
I
it's
think we have to separate like descriptive claims from like ought claims, right? Like I think that it's one thing to say that whether or not somebody has a right. It's another thing to say whether or not they should have a right. And I don't think that you can make an appeal to having a right if you don't have a form of governance or like in my example, a state to recognize that right.
can you repeat that claim one more time?
Okay. So the statement of like a right existing doesn't really matter to me, right? Like at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is how you're able to enact them or enforce them, right? So like like a black person saying that like I have rights back when slavery was before it was abolished, right? Didn't really mean anything, but like we could have a conversation of should black people have rights?
Well, I think what
Well,
Pxie
that's
is, just to clarify here, so I don't think Pxie is saying that black people needed to make the arguments that they should have rights, but rather that they did have rights and those rights weren't being respected. I think maybe you guys should define
exactly.
what you guys mean by rights. Maybe that's where the difference of agreement is.
Well, exactly, because if you say that like they or if you say somebody has a right, where does that right come from if not from whatever governance that we're talking about?
Well, it comes from the social construct, right? Right. So it comes from the social construct. Society as a whole, or sections of society, acknowledge that human beings are entitled to A or B or C thing. And as long as we recognize that those people are entitled to that, that's independent of whether the governance allows it or not.
But in my opinion, social constructs are completely meaningless if not like if you don't have a way to like protect them,
Wait, so
or
like
like
it sounds
enforce
like
them.
there's not really a disagreement here then. What you essentially saying is that you may or may not have rights, but the enforcement of the rights is what matters, not the existence of the rights themselves. Because Pixie's saying that you have rights regardless of a state existing or not, and you're not really concerned with the existence of said rights. You're not contesting that. You're saying that the right itself is not relevant without an enforcement mechanism, which is a fundamentally different claim, right?
Yeah, well, exactly, because like the statement in and of itself, I have a right to, like to blank, doesn't really like there's no utility in that argument in and of itself.
Well, I'm not exactly sure about that because when somebody says, like, I have a right to vote and that's being violated by the state, it doesn't like what it basically like has a social implication to it that you got to fight for your right, or that that the state is like violating your right, not that the state has to like be benevolent and grant you that right. The social connotation is that like more serious than that the state is not being benevolent. If they give you that right, it's your right, it's yours, and you should take it if you can. Like, it's, I guess, like maybe it's just like a semantical argument, but the implications are strongly like two different things with how we interact with our government, whether we use to go through like proper channels or through mass protest or boycotting or things like that to be able to ascertain that right.
Okay, so you're saying that like basically there is utility in saying I have a right because then that gives you the platform which to advocate for the right to recognize them?
More or less. I'm not sure if I'm being exactly clear with it, but historically speaking, this is just like I also like a matter of like semantics and like appealing to emotion when it comes to social movements. But there's a very big different statement, at least like emotionally speaking, or how you listen to it or how it resonates with people. If you say, oh, the state should grant me like
Sure, but then
said
we're not
right.
talking about whether or not a right exists. We're talking about effective rhetorics to like get rights
Well,
enacted or recognized by the state.
Well, yeah, because the conversation kind of shifted to what's effective of saying, "Oh, I have a right," or
Well,
"I do not have a right."
let's move. Well, we're not talking rhetoric, so let's move back to the principal question. So for MindWaves, so for Pxie, do you think that you rights exist regardless of the existence of a state to protect said rights?
Yes.
Okay, MindWaves, do you agree that rights exist regardless of a state that exists to defend those rights, or do you think they become non-existent?
No, absolutely not.
Okay, so then the question is, where do you think rights come from? This would be like where your disagreement would be.
I mean, but we both agree they come from social constructs. The
Well,
whole idea is that
no,
you
I
No.
don't think you agree with that, Pxie. So, for instance, like when you said earlier about blacks wanting to not be enslaved, I mean, technically, socially constructed at the time by the majority was that, well, blacks ought to be enslaved, right?
Oh, okay.
Unless you mean something different by that. Go.
Two things. I guess if this is gonna, I think, go back to philosophy, right? Because if I'm making the argument, I'm maybe I'm not like very sure about how I feel about this statement. But I would argue that humans would have some innate right to freedom, or should, because
Wait. When you say innate, what do you mean by that? Innate how? Like by virtue of being human, by virtue
yeah,
of God, what?
by virtue of being human.
But we
And
already know that's not true because, like, the way that we conceive of rights differs from culture to culture historically, and even contemporarily.
I didn't finish my argument. Um, the reason why I was going to argue that humans should have an innate right for, let's say, something like freedom would go back to like a whole philosophical argument that in order to live in a best and most prosperous society for everybody, then human beings should be allowed to be free.
Well, this is I don't know how you could say people should have an innate right. It is either innate or it is not, right?
Well, I guess, yeah. So I would just say
Okay,
should.
so you're
Well,
saying that people should have rights, that they don't
yes.
have it inherently, that it doesn't come from their humanity, right?
I'm not sure if I'm explaining myself clearly. So I think you should have
Well, here's
a
wait.
right.
The question is, Pixie? Where do you think rights come from? Is the question.
And what I was arguing before is that I do think that they are social constructs. So yeah, I think that socially constructed like rights as a whole, the reason like just like gender or just like even race up to a certain extent, these are constructs that we created. However, just because they're social constructs doesn't make it any less real necessarily. So just because we socially like
True.
have this concept of like, you know, people should be free doesn't make it any less
What about when
real.
rights are socially constructed away from people, I guess? I don't know if that makes sense. But, like, so if the majority of society believes that a minority of society should have some rights stripped from it, where would they get their rights from?
Where would the minority get their rights from?
Yeah, let's say a majority wanted to oppress a minority.
Well, that's why I was, like, trying to kind of, like, go back with the whole idea of, like, maybe some rights are innate and some aren't. Because rights is a very vague word. There's a lot of things that we could put under rights.
Well,
I would argue that
include,
the
like,
only
basic
the
things,
only right that you have innate to you from the moment you're born to the moment you die is your right to kill yourself. Like that is the only one that you can fundamentally exercise without any sort of third party protecting it or without having to enter into like some sort of social contract.
Well, where do you think rights come from then, MindWaves?
I think that we basically, yeah, we can socially construct them and enact them through governance.
So you don't think that innately, you don't think that any person has any right, that those rights are only delegated by a state?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, wait, then it sounded like earlier you guys didn't have that difference of opinion. So then MindWaves, you would argue that like a person that exists outside of a country innately has no rights granted to it.
I'm sorry, run that by me again.
So a person that exists outside of some state, that person has no rights innately.
Unless that state recognizes the rights of that person? No, absolutely not.
Okay, so hypothetically, I'm looking at this at a moral level now. I come across a person in a forest that is outside the borders of any government. Should I morally be allowed to kill that person because I don't think they innately have any rights because they don't belong to a state?
Well, I think that when we're talking about morality and rights, it's very important to separate the two.
Rights seems like a subset of ethics or something, right? Like it would have to be like any conversation.
Well,
about
I think that we base our rights off of what we perceive to be moral. I don't think that rights are inherently or rights are moral by virtue of being a right. Like
Well, what do you? Okay, so then here's a question: what do you guys both think rights are? Maybe we should have did that definition.
Well, that's what I was trying to say. I think rights are what we believe people should be entitled to.
What do you think rights are?
I think a right is what we recognize to be a right through governance. Like basically whatever humans are entitled to under a form of governance.
Okay. Well, I mean, like in that case, then you've kind of like defined, like through the definition, you must be correct, MindWaves. Right? If by definition you're saying a right is something that is recognized by the government, then of course your rights can never exist without a government, right? So you guys would have to reconcile your differences in definitions of what rights are. But this might just be semantic. Like you, MindWaves, you might say, I don't think people have rights outside of a government, but we still have some moral obligation to treat them in a certain way, in which case I imagine Pxie would probably agree. You guys would just be using different words to describe similar things, right? That would be my guess on Pxie.
Yeah, so I'm not sure how we could necessarily reconcile that difference, because I feel like Pixie's trying to like think of rights as something that's like that comes from just your humanity, and I just don't know if you could like point me towards that or anything like that.
Yeah, so
right?
the thing is that like it sounds like both of you are using different words to describe the same ideas. So you share ideas. So it sounds like if I were to ask both of you, if you find a stateless person wandering in the forest, should you be able to murder that person? Both of you would say no. Pxie would say it's because that person has rights. You would say it's because that person is like worthy of moral consideration. So you would be describing a similar concept, but you'd be using a different vocabulary to describe it. That's what it sounds like to me.
Right. I would make an appeal towards morality to not murder that person. I wouldn't say that that person necessarily has a right if it's not being if that right isn't guaranteed by some sort of form of governance.
Isn't the whole idea of rights that them in themselves are kind of like an appeal to morality? A reason for like even
no, absolutely not. I view rights as rights to me are strictly utilitarian based. I find utility in granting humans rights. I don't think that it has anything to do with morality.
I think, yeah, but it seems like the problem then is that Pxie's statement, Pxie sounds like somebody that is regarding morality, that when Pxie says, I think that people have rights irrespective of any government recognizing them, for you to step in and say, well, no, they don't, essentially makes it sound like you're saying we could just kill people that are stateless because they have no morality, unless you're very clear about the difference in vernacular that's going on here.
Well, we can, but should we or should we not?
Well, that's what I mean when I say we can. Like you ought to be able to without it being like a moral crime or something.
Well, I don't view crime as being like what is legal or illegal as being
moral crime. I'm sorry, when I say a
itself.
moral crime, I mean like something that would be morally atrocious or morally not good.
Okay. Yeah, so I would say murdering people is immoral, whether or not that person has rights guaranteed to them. Yeah.
Sure, and that immorality of murdering them is, I'm guessing, what Pxie would say. Well, that is what I consider a right. So we agree with it. You agree with it. You're just using different words to describe the same thing. What it sounds like.
I would argue that Pxie should rather make an appeal towards morality instead of like rights, because I don't know where this.
This is where we disagree on again, right? Right. My whole idea is that rights are interlinked with morality. So by making a appeal to rights, I am making an appeal to morality.
So do you think that rights define morality, or morality defines rights? Which way does that go?
Usually morality defines rights.
And why?
So Pxie, I think when she says that, what you mean, Pxie, is that like rights would be a subset of morality. That you have some moral code and then rights come from said moral code.
Absolutely.
I don't think that they have to, though, not necessarily. I think that I can make the argument for human rights without appealing to any sort of morality, right? I can say that like a human's right to privacy is good because of the utility that it grants society in general by granting them those rights.
What do you get good
without
from?
having to?
What does good mean?
Huh?
Watch out.
What I can, I would say through a utilitarian framework, which means
utilitarianism is the application of good, not the definition of good, though, right? Utilitarianism is just how we apply the good, not what the good is.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess if you take it down all the way, or if you break it down all the way, I guess you could say that like the way that we determine rights is by determining what is moral, and by the way that we determine what is moral is by determining what is good in society.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think that I necessarily disagree with that. I don't think that I don't think that anybody really could disagree with that.
Well, then my question to you would be, how come if you believe rights are a subsection of morality, then morality can exist without a state?
Of course morality can exist without a state. Absolutely. That doesn't mean that rights are.
But if you just like said that rights are a subsection of morality and they're like a way that we kind of frame morality.
Sure, but like a rectangle is not a square, but a square is or no, is it the other way around? Fuck, I forgot.
Are we talking about like
You know what I
a
mean?
parallelogram or something, or what?
Like a I don't know, fucking, but like just because like I think that rights, just because I think that we use morality to determine our rights doesn't mean that I think that morality equals rights.
Yeah, but the whole idea is morality is independent of a state or not, right? Or am I wrong?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if morality is independent of a state, and the way that we ascertain rights is as a subsection of morality, it's basically it's basically where we derive our rights from, then why would its mere existence depend on a state?
Because I don't think that your claim to have a right means anything if you're not able to enforce it.
But that's a different argument. Your argument would then be like practicality, not the mere existence of a right.
I don't know what does it mean for a right to exist? What do you mean by that?
It's a good question.
Well, that's where we go back to like appeals for morality, or where you are going back to like a utilitarian framework. It just means it's kind of like a should statement, like people should be entitled to X or Y.
Well, okay, so again, you can't say that it exists. You can make a claim that it should exist, right? That was that was the whole thing that was like kind of like driving me crazy with your argument is that you're making this claim that they can exist instead of that they should exist. You're totally
real
within
quick,
your rights.
when
I
you-
think it's totally reasonable to say that, you know, this right should exist. We should recognize this right.
When you say should exist, I think you guys are talking about the existence of two different things. I think she's talking about the existence of the innate, like, moral consideration a person should have, and you're talking about the existence of the enforcement of said innate moral consideration the person should have. It sounds like you're talking about the existence of two separate things. Does that make sense? Or do you want me to explain it in different words?
Yeah, if you could.
Yeah, so like she's
it.
arguing that rights exist. You're arguing that the application of said rights are like that. Her contention is whether or not the rights exist. Your contention is whether or not the application of the defense of the rights exists. So she says, I say that rights exist without a state. And then you say, well, I don't think rights exist without a state. She's talking about whether or not rights exist. You're talking about whether or not the application of those rights exist. So she might say, you have a right to be not enslaved. And she'd say, well, that exists even without a state. And you'd say, well, I think that doesn't exist without a state because a state needs to prevent you from being enslaved. But you guys are talking about the existence of two separate things. She's talking about rights. You're talking about an enforcement action. Did that make sense? Sorry.
I just don't see how you like what meaning or what utility does the statement of my right exists or this right exists have if you're not able to enforce it?
Well,
right?
this is where I had two arguments. One, it's in terms of like rhetoric. This is where like the rhetoric argument came from. It's a lot more powerful and it's a lot more influential to say I have a right to vote that is being violated than to say I should be granted voting rights. There, like one is just rhetoric, like just speaking pure rhetoric has a much more like emotional impact. And then the second one is that the statement that your rights come from a state, again, kind of ask for a benevolent state, if that makes any sense. So
Right. So it sounds like more like you're requesting rights instead of saying that they exist. I would argue that they don't exist until you're able to enact them or until you're able to apply them, right?
I think so in terms of what she's saying, like a more charitable way would be, like I think in Pxie's world, I think the question she would ask is, how can you demand a state respect your rights if you don't believe you have any rights to be respected without the state already respecting said rights, right? So like, let's say I want to be not enslaved. Well, why? You don't have that right because the state hasn't given it to you. Well, you're kind of in a conundrum, right? Like by what measure can you demand the respect of a right if you believe the right doesn't exist until it's already respected? Is the question.
So how could you advocate for gaining rights that you don't already have?
Yeah, so a black
without
person
appealing
says,
without appealing to that right already
being granted by the
existing.
state. A black person says, I don't want to be enslaved. And you say, well, your rights come from the state, and the state's currently enslaving you, so get bent. Like, what's the argument against that? By what right can that person respect a right to be respected when they don't exist because the state.
Yeah,
doesn't
so
grant us
I think that you can make several different arguments for the reason why a right should exist, even if it isn't already recognized by a state. You could say that, like, when it comes to slavery, for instance, that having a underclass of human beings exist is bad for society for X and Y reason. You can lay out the economic impact of not granting rights to people, the social like the sort of like social consequences of not granting certain subsets of humans rights and stuff like that.
I have
You
a
can make
question.
those appeals without saying that, like, I already have this right, you just haven't recognized it.
I have a question that kind of confused me. You just said rights should exist even if the state doesn't grant it. But then
That's Pixie's
by
whole
virtue,
argument, right?
like, yeah, by virtue, like, your right wouldn't exist if the state doesn't grant it. Like, do you understand what I'm saying? So you're saying there's these different appeals you can do, but none of them would be advocating for your right. They just would be, like, generally advocating why something shouldn't happen or should happen. Which, if you're
Well,
going to argue why something should or shouldn't happen because of the moral effects thereafter, you might as well just be talking about rights, because that's a moral subsection.
I feel like this is just like a linguistic like difference, though, isn't it? This is just like a like uh,
Well, it is a linguistic difference, but I feel like it's an important difference because it kind of shapes how we advocate for ourselves in society. So the right for healthcare, um, the right for being free, the right for being able to practice your religion. If we decide that rights are given to us by the state and granted to us by the state, then we, like, linguistically, it wouldn't make sense to argue for our rights because they would be non-existent, period. So when somebody's like, we should have the right for healthcare in America, then your argument would kind of resort to, we do not have a right for healthcare in America. It doesn't make logical sense to argue for a right for healthcare in America because the state hasn't granted us that.
do I think that, well, that's the thing, is that, like, do I think that we have a right to healthcare right now? Absolutely not. The state
Well,
doesn't recognize it, right? But we could make an argument that humans should have a right to healthcare, right? Which is what we're doing right now.
well, that's what rights are, what people should be entitled to.
Sure. But again, I wouldn't say that that right exists until we write it into legislation, right?
Well, or that we currently do not have that right. Well, that's the whole idea. We currently do not have that right, but it's still our right. Does that make sense? I feel like that sounds
No, it
contradictory.
doesn't. It doesn't make any sense at all.
Okay. By currently, okay, let's take a person who's in slavery. They have the right to be free, but at that moment, they are not free. So we have a right to healthcare, but currently we are not that right is being violated.
If you make a claim that that right to healthcare exists, where could you point it out to me, please?
But it would go back to moral obligation. People should be entitled to medical services when society
where does the state's moral obligation to recognize the average citizen's like right to healthcare, like, where does that exist?
Well, that's the argument. It's not dependent on whether the state wants to grant it to you or not. It's dependent on the social construct that we have. So society speaking acknowledges that we should do whatever can help us thrive or whatever can help us survive or create a better society. And humans, right, should, or in order to create like a better world, you can even take this from either a utilitarian or Kantian standpoint. Either way, you're going to arrive that the best thing for humanity in general would be to have healthcare. And those are moral obligations or moral things separate from the existence of the state or not.
But then again, that this is my whole argument, is that your rights are separate like rights, the concept of rights is something completely separate to the concept of morality. I would say that we oftentimes base what is or is not a right, or what should or should not be a right, off of what we perceive to be morality,
And
right?
how are they completely separate? One, you derive rights from morality then.
Sure, but like what we consider to be moral isn't always what, like, necessarily what is a right.
That's true, but it doesn't mean
Like
that rights
there
are
are a lot
not.
of moral or immoral actions in society that we don't really cover with that are not granted rights, for instance, right?
But it doesn't change the fact that rights are derived from morals. You're right in saying that they're not the same thing, but if morality exists without a state, then
Sure.
it makes logical sense for a
So
right.
if we think that healthcare, like if we think that the human right to healthcare is a moral ought, that we ought to do that because it's moral, then I would say that we need to write that into legislation and have some form of governance, like a state, recognize that. Right? That would be the argument. And then it becomes a right. Then you have the right. Then you could
So
point at it and
here's-
say, my right exists.
So here's a question to challenge MindWave's definition of right. If that's a right, can you tell me what is a meaningful difference between a right and a law? Or are these two things the exact same thing? Are all laws rights, and are all rights laws?
That's a good question. So, fuck, I actually don't even know. Like, I would have to look at the definition. So, like, no, not necessarily so, right? Because, laws are oftentimes, well, rights are prohibitive too, right? So I think that laws are what we base our, well, actually, fucking no. I have no idea. What would you say, Pixie?
I would say that the difference between law and rights is that since rights are what people should be entitled to, and laws are more of a system of governance. So a system of governance doesn't necessarily cover what people should be entitled to all the time. It's more like a playbook, if anything else.
Right. So I would say that, I would say that rights are kind of the principles in which we base our laws off of, right? We try to make sure that the laws that we write protect the rights that are granted to people already. Basically, we right?
That doesn't make much sense because laws have adapted and changed to add rights, or to add rights that we've already acknowledged that we should have, that we're entitled to.
Run that by me again.
So you're saying we are entitled to certain rights. Like, we are entitled to the right of not being enslaved. Laws have adapted to include these rights, or to acknowledge them, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have had the right, or that we shouldn't have had the right before the state acknowledged it.
Right. I feel like there's only, like, I feel like rights are kind of a subset of laws, right? Like I feel like
Are rights a subset of laws? Or are laws a subset of rights? Does morality come from laws, or do laws come from morality?
Well, laws have to be in laws have to obey what we have already, or like what we have already, like laws basically have to fall in line with what rights we have already given the people, right? So we can't have the right to not be enslaved, but then have laws that go against that right.
Sure. So here's a question. Do you believe that there are any unjust laws, or do you believe that all laws are just?
No, absolutely not. Because even then, like, governance isn't perfect. Oftentimes laws do violate people's rights.
So if a law violates somebody's rights, it seems as though the right supersedes the law, meaning that the right would have to come before the law, no?
Yeah, absolutely.
well, if a right comes before a law, what is a law except the application of force by a state? How can a state grant a right, or how can a right come from something besides an individual if a law can exist or if a right can exist outside of a law? Would be the question.
What do you mean by that? Like,
so right now, you're telling me that a right can supersede a law, which a law is generally the application of force by a state, right? A law is a state saying this is what should be. Pxie's original argument was that rights can exist independent of any type of state. And it seems as though now you're saying, well, rights can exist that supersede laws, but if a law is a decree by the state and a right can exist that supersedes that decree by the state, then where does the right come from if not from some place that's not a state? Is the question. Did that make sense?
so is this argument kind of like so it would be that like because the state can choose whether or not to recognize those rights, or that can violate those rights, that like
Well, no, I'm sorry. I'm not putting forth an argument. I'm just introducing you to a contradiction of what you've said. Earlier, it seems as though you made the statement that rights come from the state. If a right comes from the state and a law is what rights are, but then I ask you if there's an unjust law, is that possible? And you say, well, yeah, some laws could be unjust. Well, if rights come from the state and the state is telling you that you don't have this right because of a law, but you say that some laws are unjust, then it seems as though we have a contradiction. It seems like your rights must be coming from someplace besides the state if a state can be incorrect in dishing out rights by having an unjust law. So it seems as if that you either have to say, well, there are no unjust laws because the state determines your rights, so every law is by definition just, or you have to say, well, okay, rights don't come from a state because a state might not give you a right that you're entitled to. Or you could argue possibly that my definition of the word just is wrong and that you can have that. I don't know how you would do that. I think it has to be one of the other two. Does that make sense? I'm speaking a lot. If it's not that you're dumb, if it doesn't make sense, I might just be explaining it poorly.
no, I just I guess I never considered this, like what the meaningful distinction is between laws and rights, and
Well, some people don't think there's a difference, and that could be the center point of this debate, is that maybe you really do think, well, what is right is what is legal, and then you guys have a disagreement there. I don't think you believe that, because that's a pretty hard line to walk, obviously, because slavery was legal at one point, right?
right.
Wait, can we have a roll for this conversation? If you're saying that you agree with something, you have to say correct instead of right.
Okay, that makes so much more sense. Yeah, I was thinking about it.
Yeah. Because the challenge then to you would be, if you essentially think there's no difference between a right and a law, then what's the point of even having a word like right? It seems you probably don't believe that. That if the government were to pass some law that it could torture people, you would disagree with said law. You wouldn't say that, well, you don't have a right to not be tortured, right?
Right. Yeah. Well, correct. Yes. I don't know. I guess the way that I view rights is that rights are things that we have socially constructed together. We have conceived them as a society, and we look to enact those into.
Okay, wait, hold on. So real quick. Okay, we're getting really into the weeds, but when we conceive of rights, okay, socially, the conception of a right is different than the idea that we have rights. So the concept of a right,
or correct, yes.
Yeah, the concept of a right. Oh, we have a word for these things, blah 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 blah. That could be something that we socially kind of come to an agreement about. But the intrinsic part of your character that has a right, these two things are technically separate things. Just in case. So when we say that rights are socially constructed, like our understanding of what a right is might be socially constructed, but your possession of a right as being an inalienable or intrinsic part of your character, that's a separate thing. Okay, just to make sure those.
Sure. So we can conceptualize conceptualize what we should, like what rights we should have, but I would argue that those rights, unless actually enacted or guaranteed by some form of governance, doesn't actually exist. So I don't think that just because we conceptualize something that it exists. I would say that like the concept of a right, like for instance, the concept of a right to healthcare doesn't exist, but we can conceptualize it right now.
Well, then by what
right?
Well, that's
measure?
not true.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. But
No.
that's not true because you definitely have rights that would exist without a state. So, for example, let's say right now we just dissolve the state. You still have a right to freedom without the state existing. Now, you can argue that freedom is not as well protected unless if there was a state in place, but the right would still exist.
Well, that's the thing is I don't know what you mean by exist because like unless it's able to be enforced, somebody else doesn't have to necessarily recognize that right? Uh, like so like you could say that you have a right to freedom, but somebody could also claim I have the right to violate your freedom, right? And without a state to reconcile that, what meaningful existence of a right is there?
I mean, I guess it goes back to this whole idea of your right, like the right, I don't say intrinsic, but just by virtue of you being free, you have the right to freedom. And I guess that we are asking, like, where do you draw the line between one person's rights and another person's rights?
So real quick, just to intrinsic just means that it's like it's a part of you. It's granted to you by virtue of your existence. That's what intrinsic means. So like if you're a person, you have rights. Period. Just by the property of being a person means that you have rights. That's what that means.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what you're asking, MindWaves, is how do we draw the line between one person's rights and another person's rights without a third governing? And there's two things to say here. One, even without a clear line, without a third party enacting that clear line, it doesn't mean that the rights themselves do not exist. And two, maybe this is just like too much of a personal definition, but like in theory, your rights would end where another person's rights begin, right? So you're not allowed. Oh, correct. Whatever.
Sure, but without a third party to arbitrate that, to be able to decide when your rights end and another person's like begins, like it's ultimately meaningless. Then we're all just walking around with different conceptions of rights.
But it doesn't mean that they're non-existent.
Okay, but what does it mean for a right to exist then?
Well, it means that for a right to exist, again, it goes back to what people should be entitled to. And we can have different definitions of rights. People do.
Well, no, I feel like that's not true though, because you saying that like a right exists if we agree that it should exist is kind of circular logic.
Well, no, she's
like,
not saying that. She's saying that's technically your definition. She's saying that rights exist regardless of whether or not somebody else recognizes the existence of said rights, I think.
Yeah. It's what I guess the word people kind of confused because it is a social construct. But wait.
What do you mean when you say it is a social construct?
What you were mentioning before, that the word right comes from us, like as a society acknowledging that the word right is right, like is a word.
Oh yeah,
right.
so to be clear, I'm so sorry, this is so pedantic, but we can say simultaneously that the concept of rights are socially constructed, but the existence of rights themselves are intrinsic and exist independent of social construction. So I'm sorry, just to explain this. So like as a society, we acknowledge, oh, a right is something, and then here are a bunch of words for what I think a right is. But we could also say that there might be a civilization of toddlers that are all crawling around a forest. Even if they haven't socially constructed the idea of a right, we could still argue that they have rights that are intrinsic to them, even if they haven't socially constructed it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sorry, just making sure. Okay.
I don't want to pivot too much, but I have a question for you because maybe this is where it really comes down to MindWaves. Do you believe in such a thing as like objective morality?
Oh, hell no. Absolutely not.
Okay. I think that might be where our difference is.
I don't know how you could argue for objective morality unless you're going to argue that they are discoverable in nature or come from God.
I think they're discoverable by nature. I think
Really? Well, point to me
absolutely.
where in nature that you can find rights.
Well, it's a combination of emotion and logic. So we have our feelings, for example. I'm going to use the feeling fear.
Hold on. I'm sorry. I just real quick before we pivot, because now we're going to an entirely different conversation, which is fine. But whether or not somebody is a moral realist or a moral anti-realist, if we're going to analyze their statements, we have to do it with their given system. It would be kind of foolish otherwise. So, for instance, if somebody says it's not right to rape children, and I go, oh, well, actually, I disagree with your statement. And you're like, wait, what the fuck? And then you argue for 2 hours, and you're like, oh, well, I just don't believe that like right and wrong are real concepts. It's like, oh, well, hold on. Well, why would you disagree with my statement without initially asserting that you're using an entirely different moral framework to analyze it? So just as an aside, like, it's pretty important to agree on establishing your moral framework before having a conversation. I do agree that this is probably going to come down to one of you being a moral realist, one of you being an anti-realist, but that's an important thing to know beforehand. Otherwise, you're having completely different conversations past each other, right? Yeah, just, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Pxie.
So the reason why I bring up the whole thing of objective morality or not objective morality is because if you believe there is an objective morality and you believe that morality exists with or without the concept of state, then you can also believe rights are derived from it, and that's independent from state, because having a state or not would not affect your view of, or it would not affect morality per se. But if you're like an anti-realist and you don't think that there's such thing as like objective morality and you think all morality is subjective, then you're basically saying that the person in charge of...
I'm so sorry. Hold on 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'll be right back. Did I turn on debug mode? Am I going to lose all my achievements? What just happened? Why is this being so weird? Am I going to lose all my achievements? I have to reload. I don't know what's happening right now. Okay, autosave. Okay, sorry, I had a crisis. Okay, go ahead.
So if you think that rights come from our morals and you think that our morals are inherent to us, that explains why you think that our rights are inherent to us too. Right?
All right, I'm not sure if inherent is the right word, but for now, since I can't think of anyone better, like, let's go for it. Yeah, sure.
Right. So you think that like we are born with like or we enter this world with like an objective set of morals, and that
no.
because of what?
Sorry, let me be clear. I believe objective morality exists. I don't believe that we're born knowing these morals. I believe that it's something that we discern over time and logic and emotion. Like, it's not just something that, we're automatically born with. It's something that we discover.
So then you would say that these are conceptualized and not necessarily inherent in nature, right?
Well,
that until the point that we conceptualize the idea of morality or differing ideas of morality, or until the moment that we conceptualized rights, that they didn't actually exist in the universe.
I'm not sure how I feel about that statement. I'm gonna give you an analogy, and then you can tell me what you think about it. It's like if you're born into this world and you don't know what dark matter is, it doesn't mean that dark matter doesn't exist. It just means that you don't know about it. Does that make sense?
Sure, but then okay, so you're pointing towards something that we know, like that is actually part of the universe, right? I'm saying that like dark matter we know exists because we can crunch the numbers. We can find the discrepancies in our whatever. I don't know fucking the math or science behind that shit, right? But like we can find that in nature. But like the concept, the conceptualization of morality, you cannot point towards any sort of like math or science and say that this objectively exists.
Well, we kind of it's not a hard science, but we kind of can in a sense. Like, we look at basically morality derives from emotion and logic. So when a person, usually people, the vast majority of people, unless if you're like a sociopath and that's like an exception, are born with emotion. And that's from your amygdala in your brain. And your emotion gives you things like shame, empathy, grief, etc., etc. And because we as a human species, to survive, we develop this in order to be able to kind of like thrive as a society, right? If everybody was born
No,
without
I reject that morals come from emotion. I think that these are I think that you have to separate the two. Because
wait, why?
oftentimes because I think that oftentimes our emotions lead us to our emotions oftentimes lead us to do acts that are immoral, that we socially like
Well, that's why I said
acknowledge as being
emotion. That's why I said emotion plus logic. Because so you start off with this emotion. You start off with this, I don't know, fear, for example, and then you rationalize it, or you think, is this rational or not, and you dissect it, and then from the conclusion you get from there, you realize, oh, this is logical, or
But
no, this is
emotions aren't
illogical.
logical at all. Emotions
Oh, no,
are illogical by nature, right?
I
By
no, I
definition.
absolutely disagree. Um, Emotions are sometimes like a shortcut to logic. It's not always perfect, but take fear for example. If you are in the middle of a road and you see a car coming straight at you, your first instinct is to jump out of the way, to get out. Now you can logically think, okay, why is that the case? Why did I jump out when I saw that car? And the end result is because my life was in danger. Your emotion of fear shortcutted that for you. So we can
Right,
say,
but like it can also like while emotions can lead to good outcomes when it comes to survivability, it can also lead you to do very illogical things, right? So like
but that's what I'm saying.
if
They're
we're
not
talking
always
about
illogical.
sure, but if we're talking about cars, for instance, right? Just because I've seen a lot of images of car crashes that are really fucking horrible, doesn't mean that every time I'm on the road I should be fearful of my life, because it's probably not very likely that I get in a car crash every single time I'm in a fucking car, right? So like that would be you acting illogical because of your emotions, which is like
Well, yeah, I'm
um
not disagreeing with that. What I'm saying is that emotions can sometimes be a shortcut to logic, and morals come from our original
which is why I
emotional.
think emotions should be absolutely disregarded, is because they are very unreliable in giving you good outcomes.
Well, so
Well,
here's a
no,
question for Pixie. So you're saying that sometimes emotions are reliable and sometimes they're not. If you have to appeal to a second system to figure out when they are reliable or aren't reliable, why not just say that that second system is what you base morality on? Like if you've got to say that.
Exactly. I would appeal to just the logistics of it. Like if you can determine that it's logical to grant somebody or to consider like a you can make a logical argument for morality without having to appeal to emotions
no,
at
that's
all. And
not.
you would
No,
and if
no,
you do so, I
okay.
feel like you would come out with more consistent results each time.
No, because if you keep asking the why question, why is that the case? Why is that the case? Why is that the case? Why? Oh, because it's a betterment for humanity. Why does the betterment of humanity matter? Oh, because it's better for you. Why should I care about that? Because it'll go back to because it feels better. Because we should strive for that because everybody's happier. It goes back to emotion at the like very core that we're all striving, or we all
Well, the
should
reason that
strive
I want people
for
to be
happiness
happy
and
is not because
harmonious. Oh
it
yeah,
makes
no,
me
I'm
feel
not.
good that everybody else is happy. The reason I want everybody to be happy is because I think that I can live in a better society if the overall levels of happiness in society are higher, right?
Why do you want to live in a better society?
That objectively leads to a better world for me.
Why do you want to live in a better society?
Because I can experience better outcomes before I die.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, because I can experience better outcomes. I'll have better feelings from it. Like I will feel better about the world around me, or I will, end up having basically a better emotional output if my surroundings are more in tune with each other. Like it goes back to that.
Good one, Mind Waves.
Fuck off, Dan. You just wanted me to call her a bitch. Like, shut up,
Holy
Dan.
shit, Dan. Really?
I don't know what he's talking about.
All right. All right. Pull up the logs, chat. Let's go.
Yeah, go look. Look at the logs. They're clean. Don't lie. I would never say such a thing.
Uh huh.
I wish you could hear my stream. I'm paying a song just for you, Mind Waves.
I think that the important takeaway here is that, because this is kind of a separate discussion that I find helpful, is that when I try to confront people on inconsistencies or things that they say that I disagree with, I try to work within their framework, because if I assume my own, then obviously I'm going to disagree with every single thing they say, like very reasonably so. I must. So I think like the big problem with this discussion is that Pxie said, I believe that rights exist independent of a state. You interpreted that in some sort of utilitarian framework, in some sort of anti-realist utilitarian framework, whereas she's working from some intuitionism or whatever, some sort of like a moral realist framework. So to attack her when your frameworks are quite different means that both of you are basically going to be like shouting past each other. Because my guess is going to be that if you agreed with her and her moral framework that humans have some rights that exist independent of everything else, that these are just features or facts of the world, that then rights obviously would exist independent of a state, right? You'd probably agree with that? If like you should not be murdered, if that was a fact of the world, not an opinion, if that was a fact of the world, you'd probably agree that, well, that fact that could lead us to a right of not being murdered is something that would exist regardless of a state, right?
I mean, I feel like you're just asking me, like, if I agreed with Pxie's framework, would I agree with her conclusion? And I think the answer is, like, obviously yes, right?
Yeah, so
but
then
like,
the way to attack somebody else's ideas, I think, is you either have to demonstrate an inconsistency in their framework and show them that their own framework fails, or you have to attack the framework itself. But you can't take a person's idea that exists in their framework and then analyze it in your own framework and then tell them why it doesn't work, because that doesn't really make sense, right? Does it make sense why I say that?
yeah,
Yeah,
true, yeah.
Like if somebody were to tell me, in order for me to go to heaven, I need to just say 5 Hail Marys and then I can do whatever the fuck I want. If I was going to argue against a person like that, my argument wouldn't be, well, God doesn't exist, you're dumb. Well, it could be. That would be like the beginning point. But my argument wouldn't be like, oh, well, saying 5 Hail Marys isn't going to save you. And then they're like, why? And it's like, well, because that doesn't do anything. It's like, okay, well, what do you mean it doesn't do anything? It's like it would either be a conversation within the religion where I would say, well, true contrition doesn't happen by just saying a prayer. You have to mean it, and then you have to do an act of service to make up for it. Or I would say, I'm going to challenge your entire framework. But I can't just attack ideas within their framework from my own framework, because we're both going to be talking past each other the entire time. Does that make sense?
Sure, I guess. Yeah, so I have no interest in working within your framework because I think that you're wrong. But
well, that's why I was asking you about objective morality, and that's where you were talking about, and where I was talking about we derive it from emotion and logic, and where you argued no, because emotion is entirely illogical, and I was like, no,
yeah, it absolutely is.
And then you argued, well, I don't even know where we went afterwards, because you were saying you can have logical or moral frameworks without emotion, but at the end of the day, it derived back to emotion.
Sure. So I guess what I would have to do is I would try to somehow poke, like I don't know, like how
you'd have
I don't
to
know
find
how I would necessarily like attack your framework. I guess that like I would have to push back on this claim that you like I would have to push back on your ability to like make this like sort of objectivity claim that like when you claim that like morality is objective, kind of like try to poke holes in that. But
yeah, you'd have to find me an example of a moral argument that somehow does not lead back to emotion, which I don't think is possible.
I feel like this would come down to like, what do we define as like emotion then, right? Like,
I mean, it's a feeling.
Like,
it's how you feel.
Sure.
So yeah, I don't know much more to talk about this until I guess that can be answered.
It feels like a really Weasley argument to say that because my emotions exist, then we can therefore conclude that that morality exists because emotions, and then
I mean,
because of
my argument is like logic, emotion plus logic, and all morality, all like, you know, humans should be treated this way, humans shouldn't be treated that way, goes back to like whether it's logical to treat them that way or not, and whether it
when
feels
you're
okay
saying
to
like
treat them
emotions
that way
plus
or not.
logic equals morality, then like how do you do that math? What does that even mean?
Well, you start with your feeling, right? I feel afraid. Then you get premises, right? Like how basic logic works. You make a set of premises and a conclusion. So, you know, if this person attacks me, then my life will be in danger. Therefore, if there is a knife, then there is danger. Therefore, if a person has a knife and attacks me, like my life is in danger. That equals fear. That makes sense. It makes sense why you're scared, because your life is
Sure,
in
but how do
danger.
you derive morality from that?
Well, literally, what I just said. Like, you basically make a bunch of premises to justify your emotion or not. And if there's a hole in your premise or a hole in your conclusion,
Does that
then,
necessarily make it moral though?
well, generally speaking, yeah, if you have ground tight premises with a ground tight conclusion, and if, like, you know, if they all make sense in the terms of
Wait,
like how
here's-
to make the world better.
Couldn't we think of something that is like logical and based off of emotion, but isn't necessarily moral, right?
Well,
Like
yeah, you can create things like that, but what I'm talking about, like how you create morality, right? So you can have some, like, I'm trying to think about chocolate is good to eat, or like, you know, chocolate tastes good. I like chocolate, therefore chocolate is good, but that's not a moral statement. So morality goes back to like how would you treat the world around you to make it better,
Here's a
or
question.
how should we treat each other?
Let's say that you have two parents, okay? Let's say that somebody tells you that both of these parents are in charge of making the rules, okay? You've got mom and you've got dad. I'll be gendered here, okay? Let's say that mom and dad are both in charge of making the rules. Let's say that every single time mom says you can do something, you have to check with dad first to make sure it's actually okay. If this was the case, would you say that both people were truly involved in making the rules?
Yeah.
If mom never has the ability to supersede the dad, or if the dad constantly has the ability to overrule the mom, does it really seem like both players are in charge of making the rules here? If the mother can
they
always
both
be overruled?
well, no, wouldn't the child just go with the one that agrees with them?
No. We're saying
Well,
who
no.
ultimately sets what the rule is. So, for instance, the mom might say, okay, well, if you really want to, you can go to the park, and then you check with dad, and dad's like, no, you can't. You actually can't do that. Or let's say,
sorry,
No,
I
go
don't want to. Okay, but this is the whole idea. If you go to dad with a rule that mom didn't make, then like dad would either, I guess, like automatically shut it down, or dad, like it wouldn't be existent. The rule has to be posed first by mom. So as long as mom creates rules or starts the rules, dad doesn't have the power. Dad only has the power to say yes or no. So yeah, they both share in that power.
Well, wouldn't the mom just be delegating her power to the dad?
Not exactly, right? Well, yes and no. I don't know how to explain this properly. Yes, in the sense that dad has a final say. No, in the sense that he cannot create the rule.
what if dad could create the rule?
If dad could create the rule, then yeah, dad has more power.
Are we able to say that you can create rules out of logic or no?
I'm saying that all logic, like all morality, derives from emotion and then logic. So
Does it have to though? Couldn't you just use logic?
Well, no, because it always goes back to because it feels good, or because my experience is better, or because I feel like that's bad.
Well, then every action is inherently emotional then.
Unless if you're a sociopath, yeah, like every action does.
Do sociopaths not have rights?
Oh, I get that question all the time. And then that goes to like social contract theory, right? And the whole idea that as long as you acknowledge humans as a whole can partake in this, and as long as the person is like playing by the rules, then why not? I'm speaking like in general terms.
So
here,
so then
not
you
speaking
you
in
could acknowledge
disabled.
that emotion doesn't have to play any role in the decision making on whether or not somebody should have rights.
I'm saying that society as a general starts with emotion to then have logic, starts with emotion and then logic to create a framework of morality. I don't think it's possible to create a framework of morality without initially having emotion. If we were all born sociopaths, we wouldn't have been able to create this framework to begin with.
Hello?
Hi, I'm reading
Hi.
a Reddit post. What's up?
Yeah, I don't know how to like really push back against that. Like I feel like I would have to point you towards an example where emotion either shouldn't or wouldn't be involved in the decision on whether or not something's moral. And I don't know if I've worked it out that much. I don't know.
Okay, so then here would be a question for Pxie. Let's say that it almost feels like that our emotions are working as some sort of heuristic here for what harms us. Let's say you used earlier that you see a car coming at you, you dodge it without thinking, and that's an example of emotion shortcutting you to logic, right?
Mm-hmm.
What about somebody that's crossing a street and sees a black person because they're worried that they're going to get robbed?
Well, that's why I would say it's emotion plus logic. So emotions can be irrational, but that's why we introduce like a logical framework to deduce whether it's irrational or not. So I would say their fear is irrational.
And why would you say their fear is irrational? If ultimately, what if it traces back to an emotion where they just don't want to be around black people? What if that's what it like ultimately traces back to? That they would rather just not even risk it? That even a 1% chance or a 0.5% chance of getting robbed by a black person isn't worth it?
Well, yeah, that's why I said the emotion can be illogical, but that doesn't
Well,
mean
how is that
all are.
emotion illogical? The emotion to not want to be around a black person. How are you allowed to say that's an illogical emotion?
Well, why are you afraid of being around a black person?
Maybe they just
Right?
don't
You
like
start
it.
with that question. Okay, why don't you like it?
They don't like the way they look.
Okay, so I get you technically can feel whatever you want to feel towards other people, but it can be explained like why you shouldn't feel that way.
If a person just doesn't
Um,
like the way black people look, why shouldn't they feel that way?
because black people are, then it goes back to like, okay, how do you make like society a better place? Black people are also people.
What if they want a society with no black people? What if they don't really consider them the same type of person as a white person?
Well, then it would go to the whole argument that we, I guess, would have like different frameworks of morality because,
Well, no, they're
you
using
know,
their exact framework here. They're making a decision based on their emotion, the way that they feel about black people, and then they're
but they're
using
ignoring logic.
what logic? How can you command somebody by logic to like a certain race of person?
Okay, maybe I wasn't being necessarily clear enough. So morality, usually defined, or morality, the way that we generally sees it, or that people generally see it, is as like kind of a set of rules, kind of, but not really, or more like a set of values that we should have in order to make the world a better place. You know?
But when you say better, you're begging the question. What do you mean by better? Like, what would make a
Yeah.
world with black and white people better than a world with just white people?
So then it comes to a question of like, okay, harmonious, more advanced, one where we can like generally agree less crime, less people in harm, overall happiness, things like this. Things that generally make people feel better.
So when you talk about feeling better, or you talk about less crime, so right now a white nationalist could argue if we got rid of all black people in the United States with a snap of our fingers, arguably we would have less crime. And then they would feel more harmonious because they're around their fellow white people and they don't have to worry about black people.
Yeah, then I would make the argument that that's illogical because people commit crime not on virtue of their skin, but because of underlying factors.
Well, it doesn't really matter on virtue of why they commit the crime. It's just the reality that they do. So they would feel that that would be strong enough justification, combined with their earlier feelings that they just don't want to be around them, that they ought to be able to like exclude them from society as a result of that. No?
Well, no, because the idea would be then other people would take over those spots of crime, theoretically speaking, like as the population increases and as people are still stuck in poverty. So as long as that exists.
Well, but white people wouldn't be stuck in poverty the same way that black people are, right? Because you wouldn't have that racist sentiment, basically, would be gone, at least towards black people.
I guess like I'm not sure if I completely agree with that, because I do agree that historically speaking, Black people have been stuck in a system of poverty because of their race, because of factors affected by race. But I would also argue that as things currently stand right now, because of, even though race can affect your, definitely historically is a reason why you're probably poor, as well, it can affect your like job chances or you being able to go to places. Your zip code also has a huge effect on your ability to ascertain an education. So I would just argue that as long as like this like system of inequalities exist, you're going as even if you like get rid of Black people who are now stuck like seen as like lower because of their lower class or because of their lower zip code, are going to take that place, and you're going to have to like argue that all those people should be banned now, and then
Do
you
you
just
really
create a
think
new
that
subset
if we got rid of all Black people in society, that white people would all of a sudden inherit all the same characteristics of African Americans that they would have been enslaved?
No, not all characteristics of African Americans. Let me put it this way. Yesterday, when you were arguing with a white supremacist, you said, you know, I think you just like want an easy target. If it wasn't Jews, it's going to turn into like brown-haired and blonde-haired people, blue-eyed or brown-eyed people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that if you got rid of all African Americans, it's not going to be in the same level as slavery, but I do think because of like the hierarchy these white nationalists impose, they're going to find a new enemy against them.
Sure, it's possible.
Sure, but even the way that they face that like subjugation or discrimination would be very different than like the way that like Black people would, right? Like I don't think that like to me it feels like you're saying that like it kind of is like you're saying that like the only reason that Black people are discriminated against is because of their class and like their social status.
Well, no, I'm saying that,
and not because they're just
yeah,
and never because of their Blackness, right?
No. What I'm saying is that because of their race, they're in the lower class and lower status, historically speaking, and that also contributes to like basically like kind of like a circle of discrimination. But the whole argument for these white supremacists in specific is, oh, if we got rid of all Black people, we would live in a utopia because there would be less crime. But these people, like, as long as you have this underlying system where it's like hierarchical and you have people in poverty and you have like these white supremacists who by definition like think that they're superior because of their race, their target is going to invariably like shift, because we know white supremacy isn't actually like 100% about, oh, you know, about like actually thinking that you're better than Blacks or whatever. It's definitely part of that, but it's also these people are extremely insecure. They feel slighted by the world. They feel like they need an enemy to go against. So even if Black people didn't exist, white supremacists would undoubtedly find another target to hate on, and justify it by their class, justify it by their hair color, eye color, whatever it might be. So like that's what it basically boils down to. You get rid of all Black people for a white supremacist, that's not going to be fucking enough for them. They're still going to have to find something that they feel superior to, because that's what their whole ideology relies on, the ability to feel superior to another being and at the same time be able to play a victim.
Sure, but all of this is besides the fact that they might believe that like a better world could exist without Black people. That that's like an emotion that you can't really just like. How can you tell somebody that emotion is wrong?
Yeah, you feel the world would be better without Black people. So then you'd have to make a logical argument of why it would not.
Well, the logic is that you don't like Black people, and getting rid of Black people gets rid of something you don't like. It's just an emotion. That's it.
I'm trying to think about a different way to phrase this, I guess. Your emotion is dislike, and your object of dislike is Black people. So I wouldn't conflate like the whole emotion is disliking of Black people. I would say the first concept here is dislike, and then the second one is what it's attached to.
Sure. So say you dislike Black people because of the nature of Black people, and by nature I just mean you just don't like Black people. Not that they have a particular nature, but just by virtue of
their mere
Black.
existence.
Yeah.
Okay, so you dislike Black people because of their mere existence. Then you have to ask yourself why. which is why do you feel any emotion at all?
Why do they have to ask themselves that?
Well, I'm trying to construct like a moral framework, and the only way that you can like create logical
Yeah, but the
I guess,
problem
like-
is that, like, in constructing this moral framework, it seems like you're appealing to a moral framework that's going to give you, like, a conclusion that you already, like, agree with. But they might not want to, they don't think they have to ask themselves why. Maybe they think that, like, well, this is enough for me. I just don't like them, and you don't have to force me to. It'd be like asking me why I don't like spinach, and you forcing me to eat it or something, when I could just eat another type of green or something.
Well, then, yeah, it goes back to the whole idea that we have a completely different framework of morality, because for them, for them, emotion is enough.
Well, doesn't
to...
that mean that it's not
Well,
objective,
no,
though?
hold on.
I
Well,
think
the problem is
oh.
that you're using the same framework. You're just starting at different points. So the question,
Right.
the problem is that it seems as though using this framework, it seems like you'd have a hard time resolving somebody using the same framework, but just having different premises. So like they might start with the premise like, well, black people are undesirable. They might start there, and then they might build from there, and that's just based on an emotion. But you said that using emotion or intuition is a good way to arrive or discover a moral fact, that like using intuitions and emotions is a good way for doing that. So if that's true...
Well, it's a starting point. So we both have completely different starting points, because
Mhm.
my starting point is literally dislike. And then everything else comes afterwards. And you're saying their primary emotion is dislike for black people.
Mhm.
So that's a completely different starting point, because my whole
Well,
idea of
doesn't that show that it's not objective? Doesn't that show that it's subjective based on whatever the individual values?
Well, no, because at the end of the day, if we're talking about the general framework that I think most people agree with, if not every, it's how to live. Like morality is values that we
Sure,
should
but
have.
objectivity isn't based off of like a majority of people agreeing
No,
upon
yeah,
something.
yeah, okay, let me finish. The whole idea of morality is that it's a set of values to live in a better world. So we can disagree on what those set of values are to live in a better world, but if I can find flaws in your logic, or what I would argue is that there's going to be inevitably flaws in one of our arguments or one of our lines of logic, because like the answer would only result in like one way or not the other if they're both contradictory.
Yeah, my only problem, I guess, with this type of system is that if somebody else has a different emotional feeling than you, then you're kind of like fucked. Like you can't really say anything to that person. You just have to accept that they just might want to eradicate all black people. But if we're using like intuition as a justification for emotion, and then like the only way we can challenge that is with some core principle of not liking black people, we kind of just have to accept that. And it doesn't seem like we have the ability to fight back against that, or at least that's how I feel.
Well, I don't know if I was like trying to be clear enough, but this is why I was trying to emphasize so much that of black people would be a premise, or would be like a different object, wouldn't be the feeling per se. The feeling, the original core feeling is dislike. And then it's, why do I have dislike? Oh, I have this dislike because they're black. Okay, why do you dislike them because of black? And then if it's just like, oh, for their mere existence of being black, I guess my argument would be I don't buy that per se. There has to be.
How could
like,
you? But then, what
Well,
they would say
how
the
would you
same to
convince them
right?
of that, though?
They might say
Oh,
to you,
wait,
"I can't
sorry,
buy
I
that
need to
you."
start talking.
What?
Sorry, my two people were talking.
Oh yeah,
at the same
sorry.
time,
Yeah, so if somebody says to you, then I don't buy that you can seriously like black people. It's insane. Like if they say that they don't buy that, aren't you kind of both stuck on the same page? Like neither of you can kind of get off the ground with your arguments because you have that fundamental disagreement that's by definition irreconcilable because it all starts with feeling or emotion.
Well, then my argument to them would be like, well, I can prove that black people create like a more harmonious or better society.
But those words are both begging the question, right? When you say harmonious or better, they would also say, well, my society is harmonious and better. It's harmonious because it only has white people, and it's better because it doesn't have black people. But those words are both like presupposing, well, what is harmonious or what is better or good?
Yeah,
right?
I was about to say that. Then I'd have to make them define what better or harmonious is.
Harmonious is one group of people that all look the same, living together. And then, yeah, better would be a rejection of anybody that doesn't look like, share the same skin color at least, of those people living together.
Okay, so then if that is their honest to God definition of what would be a better harmonious society to them, then, you know, yes, we're stuck. Like, okay, like there's no way to like contradict that per se. But then again, I would argue that their emotions are lacking logic, or that they're missing
Well, how can you
a
say your
logical framework.
emotions are lacking logic? It seems
Sorry,
like,
your moral framework is lacking logic.
well, but they're using your moral framework. They're just starting with different premises. But the premise, because this is kind of my own problem, is that like if your premises are essentially founded in your emotional response to things, then you can't really. It seems like you can't really argue with them. Like you just have to accept it. Okay, fine. Like,
Well, no, because that's why I'm trying to say it's
Mm-hmm.
not just emotion; it's emotion plus logic. So
well, but
you
it
start
sounds like when you say, sorry, I'm interrupting. Go ahead.
when you say I dislike, I don't know, like I dislike apples or whatever.
Mhm.
Then it goes to why do you dislike apples? Oh, I dislike apples because I taste bad. Because I taste bad. Because they taste bad.
Mhm.
Therefore, I do not like apples.
Mhm.
So the whole idea is that you start with whatever emotion you feel and you ask yourself why, or you start trying to find like logical reasons for why that would make sense or why it wouldn't.
Yeah, but at the end, you can't argue with them. Like, you're essentially saying it's emotion plus logic, but what you really mean to say is, like, it's emotion plus, if I don't agree with your emotion, it's my logic until your emotion is wrong. Like, we can follow that same thing, for instance. I don't like apples. So how do you argue with me if I say, like, apples are evil, we need to get rid of them because I don't like them?
Well, I would ask you, why do you think they're evil?
Because I just don't like the nature of what an apple is. I don't like the object that is an apple.
Okay, I think I found the main contradiction here.
Mhm.
For that, it's like kind of like circular logic, right? Which I would reject. I would say that your premises cannot be the same as your emotion. They can derive from it, but it cannot be the same thing. So you can't say, I dislike Black people because I dislike Black people.
Well, how can you start with I like Black people then?
Okay, so I like Black people. Let's start there.
Well, why are you allowed to start? Well, that's an emotion, right? Not a premise.
Well, yeah, no, you're allowed to start with I dislike Black people.
Okay.
But your next premise cannot be because they're Black people,
Why
or
not?
because I dislike Black people, because that's circular logic. It's
well, but
like
if we're starting with emotion, of course, all emotion is going to be circular. If I punch you in the face and I say, and you go, well, I don't like being punched in the face, and I go, well, why? And you say, well, because I don't like the feeling of being punched in the face. I can't say like, well, that's circular logic. You're not thinking about your emotion, right? An emotional response is by definition unjustified. It's just something that happens and occurs with us, right?
Well, that's why I said it's plus logic. That's when you start asking yourself, like that's when you start going deeper and deeper. So I don't like getting punched in the face.
Uh-huh.
Why? Okay, because it hurts.
Okay,
You're
and I
not
don't like
saying
somebody
because of
says
virtue.
Sure, somebody says I don't like being in the same area as a Black person because it makes me upset.
Okay, then you ask again, why does it make you upset?
It's just the emotional feeling. Why do things hurt you?
Because the physical contact of your like fist going into my face damages my cells.
Okay, and the physical contact of the receptors in your eyes, like permitting the blackness of that person, like evokes an emotional response from you, right?
Yeah, but then you have to ask, like, is it a valid response? Like, does the virtue of being Black like actually?
Well, what would be
Like,
invalid about it? It's an emotion. Is it valid for you to get punched and not like being punched just because it hurts you? Is that valid?
I would say it's valid because there's a very real effect to that.
Well, not really. I mean, like,
Well, there's also a very real psychological effect that like humans associate the color black or darker colors with like grief or morbidity, right? Like the idea of death. So
or even more like, what if I could point to some types of pain that are actually good? So, for instance, is working out evil because your muscles hurt the next day?
But that's I guess maybe I'm just repeating myself too much. That's where you introduce logic into the equation.
I guess it feels like the frustration that I have with this system is it feels like basically you have an emotion. If you disagree with the emotion, then you're introducing something called logic, but all logic really is trying to find out some reason why this emotion is bad because it disagrees with what you consider to be good or bad. But that like you can't logically invalidate somebody's emotional response to something. Like that's just not possible, right?
Yes, we can't necessarily logically like invalidate it, but we can argue like why it wouldn't make sense in a framework of morality. If you're talking about the overall like happiness of everybody, but that's where it goes back to the question of, do we agree on what morality is? Because if my definition of morality is, or system of morality is to create like a overall like general good for people, or rules that or supposed rules or values that we should have to create a general good for everybody, but your definition of morality excludes everybody and only focuses on white people, then we're not going to agree with what morality we should have in place, period.
Okay. Anyways, going back to your initial disagreement, I think it's important to reconcile your guys' fundamental disagreements before attacking each other on Twitter about like lower order disagreements. Does that make sense? Like, I think it's pretty obvious when Pxie tweets out, your rights exist independent of a state. I mean, I don't think she's stupid enough to think that, like, well, without a state, I'll never be murdered, right? That would be, like, a pretty uncharitable reading of her to say that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty obvious that she's talking about some sort of inalienable or intrinsic right that exists to a person. So the disagreement would be there, right?
Yeah, I guess I would because I do reject your framework because I feel like people can reach different conclusions using like the sort of framework that you've laid out for what is moral, and then from what is moral to what is a right.
But we can reject somebody's
but that
framework.
that is something that I would. Well, yeah, that's something that I would have to like work out and figure out exactly why.
Yeah, and we can reject somebody's framework, but still accept their conclusions. So, for instance, I 100 trillion% reject her framework, Pixie's framework, is like how she makes like moral decisions. But when she says like, I think you can have rights independent of a state, like, yeah, that makes sense. Of course, if you believe that rights are something that are like intrinsic to a person, then yeah, that's a logically consistent statement. Of course, I would never argue with that. We might have an argument over like, our rights or is morality something like that is discoverable in the world or something, but I would never argue with that particular statement because what she's saying makes total sense, right? In terms of like how she views it, right? And how a lot of people view rights, right? I think. Yeah. Because I would say most people probably view rights as like things that are not things that are discoverable. Everybody that's religious, for instance, believes that rights are discoverable, and a lot of moral philosophers believe that rights are discoverable as well, right?
Run that by me one more time, just so the last part, I didn't catch that.
So it's looking at the way that she views morality. All of her conclusions make sense. So if we had a problem with how she viewed morality, oh my God, how did I run out of power? I'm so sorry. Okay, everything that she says makes sense within her own system. So if we were to fight against her, the fight would be against the system, not about any point made within the particular system. Does that make sense?
First time donator,
Do you have
what
any
would you call
problems?
that?
So you would have to.
Hold on one second. I'm
her
sorry.
system.
Hold on. I'm sorry. One second.
I think you mentioned.
It's not a contradiction or whatever.
Oh.
Okay, I'm
Destiny
sorry. I'm
gave
back.
a counter example of how, well, what if a white supremacist thinks that the world would be better without black people? And then my counter argument to that basically boiled down to, well, we technically would have a different definition of morality because my morality is the betterment of all people, and a white supremacist would claim that, you know, their definition of morality was best for white people. So you would have to find either a way that you can have a system of morals that doesn't go back to how you feel.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to butt in. Isn't the issue here more the verbiage of what's going on and how you said, like, I don't think anyone would have an issue if you said people should always be able to do this versus the state has historically violated human rights. Human rights can exist with or without a state.
Maybe.
Right? So it's more maybe a phrasing issue?
Well, I think my argument still makes sense there because it's a whole idea that even without a state, those rights would still exist. Like, but you can argue that the best way to protect those rights is with a state, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but it's not like if the state doesn't exist, rights don't exist.
Yeah, I don't know how I would reconcile that necessarily. I feel like
As long as you two guys aren't hating each other.
Well, I just like I guess I'm just not really not concerned. I'm really not concerned with whether or not they exist, but rather, which I've already said, right? But rather or not like whether or not Like what is the utility of like the rights, right? Like how we're able to enact them and enforce them, etc.
Yeah, but like that would be like a good discussion to bring up. So like she tweets out something like, well, what does a right matter if there's not a state there to enforce it? Like that's a separate discussion than just saying like, well, rights only come from states. Those are two fundamentally different claims, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I love both of you guys. Good job. Keep up the great work.
Okay.
The correct answer is don't get in fights on Twitter.
Wrong. That is the
Fuck that, dude.
incorrect
Then I wouldn't
answer.
have these debates. Come on, dude.
Fights
What
on
the fuck?
Twitter are the only reason worth living. That's why I'm so...
But
You
people
gotta
like
drive
me
up those
destroy-
engagements. Come on.
People like me destroyed that stuff. It's all marketing and bots now, guys. Like,
Destiny
doesn't-
is a
Twitter
virgin
doesn't
hog.
exist. It's 90% robots talking to each other, and and a bunch of people fighting about whose side the robots are on.
Well, there are real people that talk to each other. We see it in the political... These two people are real people. I'm a real person, right?
I actually think MindWaves is a bot.
There we go. That's the kind of content we're working on. Here at Shadow Inc., we're proud to encourage everyone to give up on humanity and just accept that you will spend the rest of your lives in a little box.
Damn.
Stolpism, that's the solution to all philosophical questions. Nothing exists.
Oh, good job, guys. I'm proud of all of you.
Okay. Talk to you later, alligators.
Be careful.
Later, Pixie. Hey, that money printer go burr though, you know?
This isn't even a money printer, though.